Part 1. The Call of the Sea. Recruitment, Dreams, and Deceptions. The sea, in the early 18th century, held an allure that was as treacherous as it was enchanting. For many, it was a horizon of promise, of adventure, wealth, or escape. But beneath the shimmering expanse of blue lay a world of backbreaking labor, disease-ridden decks, and a discipline so harsh that men sometimes preferred the gallows to the quarterdeck. To step aboard a ship in the 1700s was to enter a floating world that was at once a prison, a battlefield, and a home. The myth of the free sailor for the peasant lad tilling stony fields in Devon, for the apprentice weary of a master's blows in Portsmouth, or for the petty criminal hunted through the alleys of London, the sea promised freedom. Broadsheets and tavern tales spoke of fortune in the Indies, gold in Spanish galleons, and liberty beyond the king's laws. In reality, the life of a sailor was closer to slavery with a wage, and sometimes not even that. Recruitment in these times was rarely a matter of free choice. The Royal Navy, constantly at war with France, Spain, or any rival upon the oceans, needed men, thousands of them. The notorious press gangs stalked the waterfronts, dragging able-bodied men from alehouses, streets, and even their own beds to serve His Majesty at sea. It mattered little whether the man had ever set foot on a deck. Once caught, he was pressed, signed to a ship, and given the king's shilling, a token of service that was as much a curse as a coin. Press gangs and forced service. Imagine the scene. A misty evening in Plymouth, 1714. The door of the Fisherman's Arms Tavern bursts open. Red-faced men in rough coats, truncheons in hand, storm in for the king. They bellow. In moments the room is chaos. Tankards spill, fists fly, and a young cooper named Thomas Black is clubbed over the head. When he wakes, he is aboard the HMS Resolution, 3 days out to sea. His life ashore, his family, his sweetheart, his trade is gone in a heartbeat. Press gangs were not merely a nuisance. They were a terror to coastal communities. Weddings were ruined, harvests left untended, and towns mourned sons stolen to fight wars they barely understood. Resistance was futile. The law was on the Navy's side. The sailor's life began, for many, not with a bold decision to chase adventure, but with the thud of a cudgel in a smoky tavern. Volunteers and their illusions, and yet, there were volunteers, men who signed willingly, often blinded by promises of plunder. Merchant shipping, too, offered opportunities, and its recruiters painted rosy pictures: fine pay, fresh air, good food, and rum aplenty. They neglected to mention the scurvy, the lash, and the ever-present risk of never returning home. Young men from the countryside, dreaming of distant lands, boarded ships like the Sea Venture or Endeavour, only to find themselves in a world of unending toil, salt sores, and despair. For many, the first shock came with the smell. Ships reeked of tar and bilgewater, of unwashed bodies, of rot. Rats scurried in the hold, lice crawled in every hammock. A ship was not the grand floating fortress of paintings, but a cramped, groaning wooden beast, alive with vermin and ruled by iron discipline. Training the greenhorn once aboard, the novice sailor, or lubber, was broken in quickly. Orders barked in a strange tongue: hold at halyard, belay there, had to be learned instantly. Mistakes could cost lives, and officers enforced discipline with rope's end or cat-o'-nine-tails. A man who failed to climb the rigging in a storm, who froze in terror as the mast swayed high above the boiling sea, was flogged until he either learned or died. Instruction was brutal because the sea was merciless. The ocean did not forgive ignorance, and neither did the boatswain. Within weeks, soft hands grew calloused, and fear gave way to a grim competence. Yet, even as they adapted, sailors knew they were cogs in a vast, grinding machine, their lives expendable in service of empire. The ship as a world apart. To step onto a man-of-war in 1700 was to leave the world behind. Class divisions were as rigid as the ship's timbers. The captain lived in relative luxury in the great cabin, dining on roasted meats and wine, while common sailors gnawed on salted pork and weevil-infested biscuit. Officers had quarters, seamen had hammocks slung inches apart. Privacy was non-existent. The ship was a floating hierarchy, with the captain's word as law enforced, if necessary, at the end of a rope. Punishments were public and savage. A man caught stealing could be flogged to ribbons. Mutiny, even the whisper of it, brought hanging from the yardarm. The fear of punishment kept order, but it also bred resentment. Beneath the surface of obedience simmered hatred for tyrannical officers and the longing for freedom ashore, dreams and despair. And yet, for all the misery, the sea also offered moments of strange beauty. A sunrise over a glassy Atlantic, the thrill of landfall after months at sea, the camaraderie of shipmates who shared hardship and risk. These sustained many through the grind. Songs were sung in the dog watch, tales were told over mugs of watered rum. Dreams of prize money or a quiet farm someday kept hope alive, even as disease, storm, or cannonball might snuff it out tomorrow. This was the beginning of a sailor's life in the 1700s, a mix of coercion and choice, hardship and fleeting wonder, a path trodden by the desperate, the daring, and the damned alike. The call of the sea was as much a summons to suffering as to adventure, and those who answered it would soon learn the true cost of life under sail. Part 2. Life afloat. disease, rats, and the brutality of survival the moment a ship left port in the 1700s. The men aboard entered a world entirely their own, an isolated kingdom of creaking timbers, salt-stained decks, and the endless, merciless horizon. Life afloat was not merely a test of endurance, it was an ordeal of body and spirit, a gamble with sickness, vermin, and the raw indifference of the sea. This was not the romance of wind-filled sails and heroic adventure, it was survival at its most unrelenting. 1. The floating coffin. To step aboard a ship of the 18th century was to enter a cramped, stinking labyrinth below decks. The air was thick with the odor of unwashed bodies, tar, bilge water, and rotting provisions. The living quarters were dark, damp, and suffocatingly tight. Hammocks hung cheek by jowl, so close that a man could not turn without brushing against his neighbor. Privacy was non-existent. The ship devoured individuality, reducing men to parts of a groaning machine of flesh and wood. A man may die, one sailor wrote bitterly, but he cannot find solitude. Above deck, the situation was scarcely better. Salt spray soaked everything, the sun blistered skin, and storms threatened to tear both rigging and men apart. The wooden planks were perpetually slick with seawater, blood from minor injuries, or worse, vomit from those unable to withstand the relentless heaving of the ocean. 2. The curse of scurvy and other afflictions. Disease was the sailor's truest enemy. Of all ailments, none struck as cruelly as scurvy. Caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, it transformed strong men into shambling wrecks. Their gums swelled and bled, teeth loosened and fell, old wounds reopened, and skin turned a sickly yellow. Death was slow, painful, and humiliating. One naval surgeon described scurvy as a horror that unmans the crew, gnaws the body, and sunders the soul. But scurvy was not alone. Dysentery swept through crews like fire, reducing men to dehydrated husks. Typhus, spread by lice and filth, decimated crews in weeks. Fever of unknown origin. Malaria, yellow fever ravaged sailors on long voyages to tropical waters. Even a simple infected cut could become a death sentence in an age without antibiotics. Medical care aboard was rudimentary at best. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, worked in a cramped sickbay, a dim corner of the lower deck where the stench of pus and blood mingled with the perpetual reek of the bilge. Tools were few: knives, saws, forceps, and rudimentary medicines like mercury, laudanum, or opium. Amputation was the cure-all for severe injury. Without anesthesia, a man would be strapped down, screaming as the surgeon sawed through flesh and bone, while shipmates held him still. Survival was as much luck as anything. 3. The unseen plague. Rats were the ship's constant, unwanted passengers. They bred in the dark corners of the hold, feasting on grain stores and gnawing through sails and ropes. At night, they scurried over sleeping men, nibbled at crumbs, and sometimes at flesh. They carried fleas and disease, and their droppings contaminated what little food the crew had. Yet paradoxically, sailors sometimes relied on them. When provisions ran out, rat stew could mean the difference between life and death. "Better a belly of rat than none at all," muttered one desperate journal entry from a voyage in April 1742. Discipline and brutality. As deadly as disease or vermin was the ship's own command structure. Naval discipline in the 1700s was harsh to the point of cruelty. Flogging was the most common punishment, lashes across the bare back, delivered with a cat o' nine tails until flesh hung in strips. For more severe offenses, men were keel-hauled, dragged under the ship's barnacle-encrusted hull, often emerging with shredded skin or not emerging at all. Mutiny was met with swift execution, often by hanging from the yardarm as a warning to others. The officers lived in relative comfort, with better food, private quarters, and the authority of absolute rule. The common sailor endured, knowing that defiance meant death and obedience might only prolong his suffering. 5. The psychology of the endless sea months at sea warped the mind. The monotony of horizon after horizon, the grinding labor of hauling sails and swabbing decks, and the constant awareness of danger, storm, disease, attack took a heavy toll. Sailors invented songs, stories, and superstitions to cope. They carved talismans, whispered about ghost ships and sea monsters, and looked to the stars for guidance when faith in command faltered. Alcohol was both solace and curse. Rum was issued daily in many navies, meant to bolster morale and dull hardship. Yet drunkenness led to accidents, fights, and sometimes murder. Still, for many sailors, the brief burn of rum on the tongue was the only warmth they knew. 6. Death at sea. Death was constant. A man might be crushed by falling rigging, swept overboard in a gale, or waste away from fever. Funerals were brief. The dead sewn into canvas with a cannonball at the feet, slid into the sea with a solemn splash. The ocean swallowed its own, leaving no graves, no markers, only memories among the living, which were soon drowned by necessity and survival. Part 3. The Empire's engines. War, trade, and the price of the sailor's life. The ocean was never just water. For the sailors of the 1700s, it was a living, breathing battlefield of ambition. Each wave they cut through carried not only the salt of the sea, but also the invisible weight of kings, merchants, and empires that hung on their labor. To the men who manned the ships, they were mere tools, flesh and bone, powering the wooden engines of imperial conquest. I the sea as an empire's artery. Every voyage had a purpose far greater than the men aboard. A ship might leave Portsmouth or Amsterdam laden with textiles, guns, or liquor, bound for Africa, where its cargo would be exchanged for human lives. Those same lives, men, women, and children, would then be forced across the Atlantic in the stinking, suffocating holds of slave ships to toil on plantations in the Caribbean or Americas. From there, sugar, rum, and tobacco would make their way back to Europe, filling the coffers of kings and merchants alike. For the sailor, this triangular trade was less about grand strategy and more about survival. They were the living gears in this monstrous machine. They hoisted sails, manned cannons, and pumped the bilges that kept fortunes afloat. Yet their pay was meager, their lives expendable, and their loyalty bought only with rum and the promise of plunder. The irony was bitter. Sailors often drank the very rum distilled from sugar harvested by enslaved Africans. Yet they seldom questioned the cruelty of the system they sustained. For most, life was too harsh and short to think beyond the next meal or the next storm. 2. War on the open seas. But trade alone was not enough to sat Europe's appetite. War stalked the oceans like a predator. Throughout the 1700s, naval battles erupted with frightening regularity: Britain against France, Spain against Holland, all clawing for dominance over trade routes and colonies. For sailors, war meant chaos and terror. Life aboard a warship was a delicate balance of discipline and brutality. The Royal Navy's infamous articles of war dictated death for mutiny, flogging for disobedience, and starvation for laziness. Yet when the call to battle came, fear and adrenaline drowned out all else. Picture it, a calm morning shattered by the thunder of distant cannons. The crew rushes to quarters, the decks slick with seawater and sweat. Gunpowder smoke thickens the air until men can scarcely breathe. Cannons roar like gods, splintering wood and flesh alike. A man's world might end in a single splinter of oak, driven through his chest by the force of an enemy broadside. Victory, when it came, brought little reward to the common sailor. Captains and admirals took the glory and the lion's share of prize money. The crew might receive a few coins, barely enough to cover debts owed to the ship's purser, and so they fought again and again, as long as they were fit to stand or until a cannonball ended their service permanently. 3. The unseen toll. Even when cannons were silent, the sailor's body bore the hidden price of empire. The endless dampness of the sea rotted their teeth and joints. Scurvy, though better understood by the mid-18th century, still claimed thousands who lacked access to fresh provisions. Fevers contracted in tropical ports swept through ships like wildfire, killing more men than enemy fire ever could. And then there were the mental scars. Sailors rarely spoke of the friends they watched drown, the ships that vanished in storms, or the horrors they committed during raids and blockades. Trauma was masked with rum and jest, but it festered nonetheless. Some deserted at the first opportunity, risking hanging if caught. Others simply withered, becoming hollow-eyed ghosts of men before 30. For the price of empire. By the century's end, Europe's dominance of the seas was undisputed, but it had been purchased with rivers of blood and the suffering of millions sailors, slaves, and colonized peoples alike. Ships were the lifeblood of empire, and sailors were the beating heart that kept them alive. Yet for all their sacrifice, their names were seldom recorded, their graves often the sea itself. The empire's engines kept turning, indifferent to the lives they consumed. Part 4. The Last Voyage. Legacy, Decline, and the Forgotten Men of the Sea. 1. The setting sun of an era. By the final decades of the 18th century, the great age of sail was beginning to show cracks in its once unshakable facade. The ocean still roared, still claimed men without mercy, but the world itself was shifting. Nations had fought and bled for supremacy of the seas, and while Britain emerged dominant, the cost to the men who made that empire possible was profound and, for most of them, unacknowledged. Sailors had long been the unseen gears in the machinery of empire, but with the turn of the century, those gears began to grind down. The brutality of naval life, once accepted as the natural order, was increasingly questioned. Public trials exposed the savage punishments meted out aboard ships. The mutinies at Spithead and the Nore in 1797 revealed that even the Royal Navy's iron grip could fracture. Sailors, long treated as expendable, dared to demand fair pay, decent rations, and humane treatment. Yet, as empires adapted and industrialization dawned, the romance of the sea began to fade into a nostalgic haze, one that conveniently ignored the suffering behind it. 2. Forgotten in victory. For every celebrated admiral immortalized in bronze, there were thousands of nameless sailors whose lives vanished like mist over the waves. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 was hailed as Britain's crowning naval triumph, securing control of the seas for a century. But what of the carpenter's mate who bled out below deck, or the powder monkey, a 12-year-old boy who lost both arms when a cannon burst? These men returned home, if they returned at all, to a land that scarcely cared. Many were maimed, destitute, and unable to work. Some begged in the streets of Portsmouth and London. Others wandered to sea again, knowing no other life but hardship. The pensions promised to them were meager, often stolen by corrupt officials. Their sacrifices were not written in grand histories. They were swallowed by the sea and forgotten by the empire they built. In America, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the story was much the same. Sailors' lives were spent cheaply, expended in wars whose rewards flowed to merchants and kings. Even in peacetime, their labor underpinned global trade, but they reaped almost none of its wealth. 3. The decline of wooden worlds. The 19th century brought with it steam power and iron hulls, and with them, the death knell of the wooden sailing ships that had once ruled the oceans. Progress was inevitable, but it also meant the passing of a world that had defined generations of men. For sailors of the old breed, the transition was bittersweet. Steamships required fewer crew, reducing opportunities for work. The romance of rigging and sails gave way to coal smoke and churning engines. The skills honed over centuries reefing sails in a gale, navigating by stars, coaxing a ship through doldrums were rendered obsolete by mechanical precision. Some sailors adapted, many did not. Those who could not find a place in this new world sank into poverty. Their very culture songs, superstitions, even their unique dialect began to vanish. The sea itself was changing too. Trade routes became faster and more reliable, but also more impersonal. What had once been a world of perilous adventure became a commercial highway. For the legacy of the sailors' toil yet, for all their anonymity, sailors left an indelible mark on history. They carried ideas, languages, and cultures across oceans. They brought the world closer, for better and for worse, facilitating global trade, but also empire, colonization, and slavery. Their suffering also seeded change. The horrors of press ganging inspired reforms. The exposure of scurvy's cure revolutionized naval medicine. The memory of mutinies led to better conditions aboard ships. Even their song shanties that once synchronized labor at sea survive as echoes of a vanished world. Modern navies, with their strict codes of conduct and improved welfare for sailors, owe their existence to the countless forgotten men who endured unimaginable hardship. They were the backbone of empire, but they were also human beings who, in their endurance, forced the world to see their worth eventually. 5. Epilogue. The ghosts beneath the waves today. When one stands on a quiet harbor and watches the sun sink beyond the horizon, it is hard not to think of them, the sailors of the 18th century, whose lives were spent between endless sky and unyielding sea. Their graves lie in coral reefs and cold depths, their names carved only in ship's logs, long since rotted away. And yet, they remain, in the creak of a wooden dock, in the salt temps of a storm, in the roll of waves under a restless moon. They remind us that history's greatest triumphs are built not only by kings and admirals, but by the countless forgotten souls who bore the weight of the world and were left to vanish into its tides. For theirs was not just a life of hardship, but of resilience, proof that even in the face of cruelty, human endurance can carve meaning from the vast and indifferent sea.